So in Uganda today, President Yoweri Museveni has signed the controversial anti-homosexuality bill into law, despite widespread condemnation from a few months ago already. The legislation was first passed by members of parliament in March, but was returned to parliament for amendment. It initially criminalised identifying as homosexual, but President Museveni argued that this would be impractical to enforce. Well, in the new law, the offence, as they are saying, of homosexuality is now limited to gay sexual acts, with those convicted facing up to life imprisonment. Let's speak to LGBTIQ human rights organisation Outright International. They've been keenly following developments in the Museveni story, and the Executive Director, Maria Sjödin, joins us tonight from New York. A very good evening to you, Maria. Thankful for your time. So let me get then your reaction. Some have described this as state-sponsored homophobia. Is that right?
Absolutely. And the idea is that same-sex relations are already criminal under the colonial era law that was, put in place by the British colonial powers. But this law that has now passed goes much further, and at Outright, in our analysis, we consider this to be based on genocidal ideology. Mm-hmm. It will prohibit landlords from renting to LGBT people. It will ban any promotion of equality or economic inclusion for LGBT communities. And it really limits the freedom of expression for anyone in the country, not just LGBT people.
And what about policing what would be called by the Museveni government homosexual sexual acts? How does one even begin to police that, I wonder, because much of that, I'd imagine, would happen in people's homes?
For sure, but I think that is in part why this law is now being passed, because it is not just about policing the sexual acts, which were already criminal, but it's about stopping the idea that LGBT organizations and human rights defenders can even put forward the ideas of freedom of expression or human rights for everyone, things that actually Uganda as a nation has already signed on to. Human rights are for everyone, and they're not limited based on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. But through this law, even talking about issues around LGBT people is no longer possible.
And it's worth pointing out, is it not, that as much as this has caused outrage and alarm for queer people in Uganda specifically, they're not the only country on the continent with these laws, because about 32, as I understand it, African states have similar laws of some fashion in place as we speak.
Yes, and most of these laws, there are about 65 countries in the world and about half of them in Africa that have these laws. Most of them are a holdover from colonial era laws. There have been a number of countries around the world that have decriminalized in recent years, including in the Caribbean, in Singapore, India in 2018. So there have been changes. But it's important also to know that this isn't just about the laws themselves. What also happens is that politicians and leaders, and even the mere existence of these laws, can empower people to take violence and threats into their own hands. Mm-hmm. And we have seen a rise of this in Uganda in the lead up to the passing of this law. And
in other countries where there are similar anti-gay laws, Maria, am I right to say there are also concerns around surveillance, where sometimes undercover operations are basically conducted to snuff out people who are gay, lesbian, or who are somewhere along the LGBTQI plus community?
Yeah, absolutely. That is something we've seen in several countries. And of course, it's horrifying to think that you want to just meet up with someone and they might actually be there to entrap you. So I think it's really important to understand that these laws are not just limiting rights of LGBT people, but they really do incite violence against the communities themselves, but they also target those who are allies, family members who are no longer, for example, in the case of Uganda, allowed to rent to any LGBT person knowingly.
You mentioned something very important earlier, the issue of family landlords, for example, not wanting to perhaps rent an apartment out to someone who is gay now you also have people who will likely be cast out by their communities. Further isolation, that will also have other detrimental impacts on people. I'm imagining a lot of mental strain, for example.
Yes, of course. And I think it will limit people, accessing health care, accessing HIV medication, anything that could put people at risk, and if they fear they might be exposed in any way. So I think it's really important to understand that a law like this does not just have an effect on a minority, which would in itself be horrifying, but it really will have detrimental effect on society as a whole.
You used the word colonial in the beginning of our conversation. Some comments attributed to President Museveni. Speaking about this, he urged lawmakers basically to resist pressure from imperialists, suggesting interference, especially from the West, because there was the threat of sanction in March when this appeared to be gaining momentum. Do you think we'll actually see countries who have threatened that action indeed impose sanctions on Uganda? And if so, won't that basically punish the victims of such laws as well? Because much of the international donor funding goes to, for example, healthcare services for the poor.
I think what we have seen from Ugandan groups is that they have called for a strong international response. And I want to come back to this idea that these laws in the first place were put in place by mostly the British colonial powers. And so I think it would be the best way forward, obviously, would be to reject those colonial laws to begin with and move forward with respect to every person in society.
Maria Sjödin, good to speak to you, Director at Outright International. Apologies for that. I'm not too clear why we keep cutting to another shot, but I'll tell you why. What actually, because we're going to speak about that in a moment. South Africa marking Child Protection Week, and we'll get a sense of where we are with calls to stop the cycle of neglect, abuse, violence and exploitation.